This video is brought to you by Magellan TV. Discover a new type of documentary film experience with Magellan TV and its binge-worthy documentaries. Updated every week. More on them in a bit. More than half a century ago, nearly 12,000 Londoners were killed over a single weekend. Not from Nazi V-2 rockets, a virulent strain of influenza, or a massive earthquake emanating from some distant North Sea trench. Instead, droves of residents succumbed to the ravages of a toxic smog bank of epic proportions that enveloped much of the city on the morning of December 5th, 1952. Although it's one of the world's great cities, England's capital has never been known for air quality. In fact, it's unlikely that a doctor has ever said to a patient with chronic respiratory issues, "Go and spend a winter in London." Anyway, Londoners had been experiencing a cold snap for weeks, which meant that more of them were burning coal to keep warm. Though it wasn't anything out of the ordinary, a kind of perfect storm was brewing, one that would lead to one of contemporary England's largest non-war losses of life. With a large river running through its heart and surrounded by low hills, marshes, and the English Channel to the east, London has always been prone to natural winter fog. But as the city's population and industries grew, these fogs became more dense and frequent, and they hung around longer than usual too. Even as far back as the 13th century, historical records show that London was frequently shrouded in expansive hazes that were later named pea supers for their greenish-yellow hues and thick consistencies. These hybrid smogs were the result of natural fog and man-made pollutants, primarily smoke and soot from burning coal, but they were exacerbated later by gasoline, diesel, and jet engines in cars, boats, buses, trucks, and airliners, and all manner of toxic particulate-filled emissions from the factories that had been city mainstays since the Industrial Revolution. In other words, by the time the 1950s rolled around, poor air quality wasn't exactly front-page news in the city of 8.6 million, but that was going to change just a few weeks before Christmas in 1952, when the conditions responsible for creating the Great Fog came about. In those days, electric and natural gas heating systems were far from common. Coal was the primary source of warmth, cooking, and industrial power, and unlike much of what's used in developed countries around the world today, it was high in sulfur, which made it particularly dirty. But there were other factors too, like radiation fog, which typically occurs at night in the fall and winter when ground cooling causes fog to form as the air becomes saturated with condensation. And on that night, the city was experiencing another weather phenomena as well, called temperature inversion. During temperature inversion, atmospheric temperatures don't decrease regularly with altitude, as is usually the case. Instead, a layer of warm air suspends between cooler air above and below, causing a bottling effect, especially during windless conditions. Inversions are usually reversed in the morning when the sun's warmth heats the ground and burns off moisture, but on that particular morning, the reversal never happened. What did happen was like something out of an Alfred Hitchcock movie. A mass of still air, the color of pancreatic fluid that reeked of rotten eggs and was chock full of lung-choking coal particles, began forming over the sleeping city. One that would eventually grow to more than 30 miles wide in some areas, all but obscuring historic landmarks like Big Ben, St. Paul's Cathedral, and the Tower of London. In fact, measurements showed that particulate matter in the air was more than 50 times higher than it should have been. Yet, surprisingly, many went about their routines much like they did every other day. In the beginning, restaurants and movie theaters remained open, though even indoors it was tough to read menus and movie screens were little more than amorphous blobs of distant light. In some parts of the city, the smog was already so overwhelming that pedestrians couldn't see their own feet. Most sporting events were cancelled, though a cross-country running competition between Cambridge and Oxford went full speed ahead at Wimbledon Common, where harried track marshals were repeatedly shouting, "This way!" as runners emerged from the miasma. Those brave enough to venture out in cars turned on their headlights, wrapped scarves over their noses and mouths, and hung their heads out of the window as they inched along through the murky gloom. Some found the going so tedious and dangerous that they abandoned their vehicles altogether. Flashlight-yielding policemen guided bewildered bus drivers to safe parking areas where they too were left, and wheezing walkers stumbled toward home or the market, being extra careful not to slip on the primordial ooze that had cast a slippery sheen on everything from streets and sidewalks to handrails and stairs. People who'd been out for just a few minutes looked like coal miners after an all-night shift. Airports were shuttered and commerce on the Thames ground to a halt. All that remained open was the underground. People died in the street in appalling conditions, especially the young, elderly, homeless, and malnourished. And the effects were not limited to humans. Suffocated birds fell from the sky while others crashed into buildings, breaking their necks. Livestock and house pets keeled over in droves, and championship stock breeders took to dousing grain sacks in whiskey and placing them over their heads to filter out the deadly particles in the air. But it wasn't all doom and gloom for everybody. Enterprising burglars, pickpockets, and purse snatchers had a field day secure in the knowledge that their identities would remain hidden and they could retreat into the darkness at will after committing their crimes. Thankfully, after 5 days of hell, on December the 9th, the noxious cloud known as the Great Smog finally began dissipating and drifting east and north out over the English Channel and eventually the North Sea. Now, just before we get into the aftermath of all this, let me take a quick moment to tell you about today's fantastic sponsor, Magellan TV. Magellan TV is a new documentary streaming service founded by filmmakers who love history. They believe in that old adage about studying history. You can't know where you're going until you understand where you've been. As a result, Magellan TV has one of the richest catalogs of history content available pretty much anywhere today. Everything from the Greeks to the Great War, plus modern history, biographies, scientific profiles, true crime, and so much more. Their team of producers and content developers look all over the world for new documentaries to add to their library, updating it every single week. The end product is like if Netflix was designed by your favorite history professor. And what's one thing to love about paid streaming services? No ads! And you won't find any ads on Magellan TV because there's nothing worse than when the one thing you're trying to watch keeps getting interrupted by adverts. So, if you're looking for 4K explorations of binge-worthy topics, you should consider Magellan TV. Personally, I'd recommend a short series called The Magnificent Three. It's profiles of Amsterdam, New York City, and rather appropriately for this video, London. It shows how the history and innovations of those cities shaped the development of modern cosmopolitan cities today, so definitely go check it out. And right now, Magellan is offering buy one get one free gift cards just in time for the holiday season, so if you want to give the gift of knowledge this holiday season, click on our link in the description below and there will be a banner to take advantage of this limited offer for you guys. Also, purchasing a gift card at any time of year will give you an additional month of Magellan TV for free, so you can give the gift of Magellan while also getting a little something for yourself. Again, just click the link in the description below and Magellan will hook you up, and let's get back to it. Though there's no way to calculate how much industrial filth hung in the air, it's been estimated that up to 10,000 tons of smog choked London, including nearly 1,000 tons of sulfuric acid and 200 tons of hydrochloric acid. The indiscriminate smog spared no one, regardless of age, gender, or social status, but it was particularly tough on the young and the old, and those with pre-existing respiratory problems like smokers and asthmatics. Deaths from bronchitis and pneumonia-related complications increased nearly eightfold. The death rate in London's East End, an area notorious for its institutional poverty, overcrowding, and poor sanitation, increased by a factor of 10. Initial reports estimated that about 4,000 Londoners died as a result, but rumours circulated that the actual number was much higher and that the government was intentionally downplaying the incident to deflect liability and save face. All told, final numbers came in about 3 times as high, a fact largely driven home by data from mortuaries and florists who ran out of coffins and flowers due to the glut of funerals. And the effects were far from short-lived, because for years after, death rates among more susceptible segments of society remained drastically elevated. Though it happened in typical lethargic fashion, the government did investigate the incident and eventually bowed to pressure and passed the Clean Air Act of 1956, which finally put into place meaningful and enforceable regulations in regard to both domestic and industrial pollution. The act was widely regarded as a turning point in the country's budding environmental movement, and among a number of notable provisions, one included subsidies to households to convert from coal to cleaner energy sources like electricity and natural gas. It also mandated stricter standards for industrial emissions and the creation of smoke-free zones throughout the city. The letter of the law was clear, but implementation was slowed by special interest groups and politicians concerned about the act's social and economic ramifications. But although things were moving in the right direction, another event similar to the Great Smog occurred in 1962. It only resulted in the death of 750 Londoners, and though nothing on the scale of the Great Smog ever happened again, it was obvious to many that the city's air quality and pollution problems were far from solved. Another, even more strict act was passed in 1968, but in the birthplace of the first industrial revolution, it wasn't until the 1980s that the skies over London became largely free from man-made pollutants, and the health and quality of life life of its residents improved significantly. Thankfully, smog of such monumental proportions is a thing of the past, but environmental activists still claim that the UK's air isn't as clean as it should be, and they point to studies which conclude that dirty air is still responsible for the deaths of more than 30,000 of their countrymen each year, not only in London, but in large urban and industrial cities in the north, like Birmingham, Sheffield, and Newcastle. Though there are numerous ways to define and measure air quality these days, you won't find London on any list purporting to rank the cities with the dirtiest air. Instead, the top spots are populated by developing nations like India, Indonesia, Bangladesh, and Vietnam. And some of China's industrial centers also rank pretty high as well. In total, it's thought that China emits about a third of the pollution pumped into the world's atmosphere every year. But less developed countries where pollution is high and regulation is spotty certainly don't have a monopoly on dirty air. In September of 2020, Los Angeles recorded its worst air quality in decades when, over Labor Day weekend, unprecedented heat, pollution, and ozone levels prompted municipal governments across Southern and Central California to suggest that residents stay indoors, as the air outside was characterized as very unhealthy by the Federal Air Quality Index. According to Global Citizen, the top 3 cities for poor air quality in the United States, LA, Riverside, and Bakersfield, are all in California, and combined, about 2,000 of their residents die prematurely every year as a result. But compared to what the Global Burden of Disease study found, it's barely a drop in the bucket, because according to them, more than 1 million Chinese people die from poor air quality every year. In fact, many of China's modern industrial cities regularly experience events similar to the Great Smog of '52, especially during the winter when industrial, household, and vehicular emissions are high and similar weather conditions exist. And in addition to suspended coal particles, China's air is often chock full of toxins and contaminants, which doctors say may reduce the average lifespan of residents by as many as 5 years. So I'm not going to ask whether you enjoyed today's video, but I do hope you found it interesting. If you did, please do hit that thumbs up button below. Please do consider supporting this show by supporting our fantastic sponsor, Magellan TV, who I'm linking to below. And thank you for watching.